Welcome to the James Hush Show. Today we have David. David started Superstruct to build a repeatable system for finding, recruiting, vetting, onboarding, and managing talented software engineers. The system integrates over 10 years of software engineering management experience with deep technical knowledge to help companies clear milestones faster, cheaper, and with less risk. David has led teams of engineers to ship projects like the ultra high scale ad servers, handling over 10 billion requests per day, online learning systems, white label performance marketing, software as a service platforms, and Project Matterhorn, the system that would eventually become Disney.com. More importantly, I haven't talked to David in over a year, and I'm excited to talk to him. We met at JSLA probably 4 or 5 years ago, so I'm excited to have this conversation. Welcome, David.
Thank you
How are
for
things going with
having
you?
me. Things are
No
great. How you
problem.
doing?
I'm doing great. It's the last. I'm glad I moved here. Like
Yeah.
at first, like yeah. So I moved. Like we met in Los Angeles years ago. Then moved out to Asia a year ago now, and I've signed
Oh,
another 1 year lease. So I'm here for at
wow,
least another year.
been a whole year.
And it's been a
I
whole
mean, this is
year.
so cliche to like comment about where the hell does time go and pandemic and all that fun stuff, but seriously, that's breaks my brain when I hear things like that. That's
Yeah.
congrats.
Are you still doing JSLA virtually,
Mm-hmm.
or is it
Mm-hmm.
in person, or is it a little bit of both?
No, it's still virtual. So the next one is going to be on January 27th, depending on when this comes out. That could be in the past, but yeah, definitely still online using Rambly.
Yeah. And I'm so happy that out in Taipei, like all the events are in person, and they've been in person for a
Mm.
while now.
By
The
staying up
downside,
super late. Yeah.
well, it's actually fine
Yeah.
unless I have a meeting during the day in
Mm.
Taiwan because it's at like 10 o'clock in the
Oh,
morning or 11 in the
got it.
morning my time. So that part's great on the virtual side. But I feel like when you do an in-person event, it just requires that extra level of commitment from every attendee to just like get in their car, drive to the event. And so it's like almost like a natural filter for people who actually
Hmm.
want to go out and meet people versus when I was doing a lot of the times the issue I have with some of the online events is it's really hard to keep people's attention because
Mm-hmm.
you'll be presenting something and you know in the back of your head they're like looking at their phones
Oh,
versus
it's not even their
there's
phone. They probably have like they got you in the minimized, and then they've got like another browser tab open or something, or just on Hacker News or whatever.
at least in the in-person events like there's a social stigma. Well,
Oh
there should
yeah,
be social stigma to look at your phones. I was at one in-person event where a guy was looking at his phone in the front row, and like the
I mean that's
person hosting
pretty.
called him out
Yeah, I
on
mean
it.
sadly that's like common at a lot of conferences and things. Like I mean I agree the front row that's pretty egregious. Typically you do that in the back row. Um, I mean also I wouldn't want anyone seeing what I was looking at, but I agree the social conventions are important.
Yeah. So you mentioned to me earlier. Oh, we were talking a few weeks ago. You mentioned to me you were working on a new book. So what's it about, and what are your goals for this book?
Yeah, so this book right now has the title of it's the Superstruct Manifesto, and it's really a survival guide for people who depend on engineers to get things done. And it's really taking a lot of the principles that I've developed in recruiting and managing engineers over the years, and just making them kind of pretty clear for people to understand. So a lot of people might be really new to managing a team of engineers, and common things that might come up is you might wind up really afraid of your engineers, right? They're really hard to recruit, they're hard to replace, and so if they tell you that they need to rewrite your entire app and it's going to take 4 or 8 weeks before you can get the next feature that you want, you're inclined to just say, okay, let me know when it's done meekly, and then go try and figure out how to explain that to your boss or your investor or whatever. And so it's a lot of how to think about those situations and really how to make the most out of your team.
I'll read that one. So when that was, oh man, I learned a lot. Yeah, because I was managing engineering team at like a super fast growing startup, and there's all these mistakes I made that if
Hmm.
you look at any YouTube video of any manager, they all tell you the same mistakes, but I feel like you have to read it
You
five
gotta
times and
go
then
through
experience
it yourself. Yeah, I
and
don't
go
know.
through it.
It's
You're like,
like
oh yeah, that's
yeah.
yeah,
It's true that learning from mistakes is a very effective teacher. I'd like to think that the best way to do it is from other people's mistakes, but you bring up a good point, which is that sometimes it's just matter. Yeah, it's better if you stick your hand on the hot stove. That somehow sticks better than just like watching someone else do it. But I'd like to think that you can learn a lot from reading.
yeah, a, 1,000%. Um, so how did you first get started, like hiring engineers in like different time zones and different countries? Like, what drew you to like have to do that in the first place?
Oh man. So I have always, I guess always is a pretty imprecise word, but really for as long as I can remember, I have really loved the idea of working remote. And so it's just kind of nuts talking about that today because it's like, man, I really liked drinking water, and like everyone's like, yes, we all drink water. Like why are you even talking about this? It's like everything is remote today, but for a long time, this was pretty um, controversial for a lot of companies. The idea that you could have remote engineers or just remote employees because like what are they gonna what are they doing all day? You can't watch them. Or what if you need to just tap on their shoulder and interrupt whatever the hell they're doing? Like how do you do that? And I just, knowing myself, really, I just saw a ton of value in it. It was always interesting to me, the idea to go travel and work from anywhere. And trying to build up the culture and the processes that are necessary to support remote work were really the first step. So um, pretty pretty early on, even though I was hiring engineers that were in the same city as me, like they were in Los Angeles, um, I was working remote, and so they were working remote as well. And it's really interesting because it was a huge shock to me because I thought that everyone was going to love remote as much as I did. Like the only reason why people didn't work remote is because most companies were crazy and they wanted your butts and seats. And so I thought as soon as I was the boss and I was like, "Hey, you get to work remote," it was just going to like work perfectly. But the truth is it's it's kind of hard. It's very hard to do right. I think a lot of companies have learned that over time and have made their own mistakes and probably have gotten pretty good at it. But it just became a natural extension of that, which I honestly wouldn't be surprised if we see now the rest of the world catch up is, oh, wait, we don't necessarily, now that we're remote, we don't have to hire locally. We can hire people in other countries with lower cost of living. And that brought with it its own challenges, but it's been this puzzle that I've fallen in love with for a long time.
Yeah, I think the hardest thing I had to deal with when like managing a remote team wasn't necessarily the remote. The remote part for me, it was the time zone. Like you mentioned hiring in
I
other
was
countries,
wondering,
it
yeah, I
was the
was
time
wondering if you
zones.
were going to say time zone. I think time
Out
zone
of
is really, that's the first one I think I
That's
hear.
the
That
first one.
one, yeah, I mean, it's just if you think about it, like I don't know, if you just want to put it in terms of just the way the internet works, is there's two measures of bandwidth. Like it's not just throughput, but it's also latency.
Yeah.
And so if latency is really high, it makes certain things impossible. Like there's certain types of games that you cannot play if your latency is super high. There's other games that it doesn't really matter as much, or certain activities that don't matter as much, right? Netflix is crazy bandwidth intensive but has no latency requirements. And then there's other games that are probably like really light on throughput, but have pretty intense latency requirements. And work is often like that too. A lot of work doesn't require low latency. But as you get to the end of projects, I think that's probably one of the more famous examples, is as you get close to delivering something, there's all of these little things that pop up need to get to be adjusted. And if you have high latency and you wind up with 20 things that need to get adjusted, you can blow your deadline by 20 days easily. Because like
Yeah.
every time that carrier pigeon goes back and forth, you lose a day. And I mean, 20 days is probably a month, like if you factor in weekends and nonsense like that. So that is something that a lot of companies run into pretty early on and causes problems.
Yeah, and also I found, and this is not just engineering either. There's other teams and other departments too. Is you have to be careful because some people, what they like to do is they like to forward the email, or like send the Slack message, and then log right off. Like, and
Yeah.
or like instead of because I'm always, because my engineer brain is always like, okay, I'm gonna ask this question and spend the extra 15 minutes on my end clarifying this and this and this and this and try to think of all the responses, because in my
Mm-hmm.
brain I'm like, I want to be able to tell someone on my team, like an engineer, exactly what to do so I can go to sleep and then I can wake
Mm-hmm.
up and it's done the next day. Have you run into people who will kind of like almost like toss the hot potato back to you or toss the hot potato away? Uh, and it's almost like maybe they're not doing it on purpose, but it's almost like a way of like tossing the task for an extra day or so. Have you ever like ran into anything like that, and how have you dealt with that?
I mean, honestly, I think I deal with that less now. I feel like that was so common in like big corporations, like working for Disney and AT&T. I think that is it's like a self defense mechanism in companies that lean a little bit more towards bureaucracy. Um, if you're asking about like the teams that I run, that is much less of an issue because my answer to the time zone problem that we talked about before was that there is no time zone problem. Like, this is when we work. And so I guess it's possible for someone to lob something like that back, but I don't know, kind of it like sort of has a different effect. Like, I to be honest, that's not something I see a lot
Mm.
on my teams.
I think it's that, and going back to the time zone problem, I think that's, if I were to do everything, that's the number one thing I learned while trying to lead a remote team, is if I were to do
Yeah.
it all over again, same as you, there is no time zone problem. It's like Hong Kong, 9 o'clock in the morning Hong Kong time, until 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the evening Hong Kong time. If you don't
Totally.
like it, that's completely okay.
Yeah, that's totally
We can just
fine. Yeah.
we can just hire another React developer, and that's fine. And no,
Yeah.
and no
Yeah. I
big
mean,
deal.
because
We're still friends.
yeah, I can understand like why people think that this is a problem. Like the default is to think like, oh no, but like how can you make somebody work all night? And it's like, come on, we've got cops and firefighters and nurses and doctors and there's tons of security guards. There are so many professions that do this and have families and I'm not going to pretend that it's not without downsides, but it also has a lot of benefits too. I think a lot of people really enjoy having that schedule. So it can certainly affect the type of engineers that you're going to find, but I don't know. It's no means a deal breaker, nor do I think it is worth dealing with all the headaches that you would by having people work on like a completely flipped time zone.
I agree. And my dad, he was an electrician in a car factory for he was on steady midnights for 10 plus years.
Okay.
And the way the car factory got him to work midnights, crazy tip here, only available on this podcast, was they paid him more money. The midnight shifts just paid more, right? And so,
Wild.
uh, yeah, so the idea of getting everyone to go in the same time zone, especially if you're hiring someone from out here in Asia or like India or something like that, and he's just really upfront coming in like, hey, like, we're working 9 to 5 Los Angeles time. You okay with that? Because that's what's
Hmm.
happening. And if I need to contact you and you're not there, like then isn't going to be a good fit.
There's a problem. Yeah.
And in return, you're going to get paid more than your market rate.
Yeah.
Okay. it's
Yeah.
a,
Yeah.
and I have a lot of friends out here, especially other like foreigners like myself. It's always funny calling myself a foreigner, but
Mm-hmm.
foreigners like myself who do that schedule, who like they'll go to bed like 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning to like sync up with New York.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that being said, I noticed though, especially in particular out in Taiwan, people have this mindset of like this is possible, this isn't possible. So a common one I hear from engineers out here is like, oh, it's impossible for any engineer in Taiwan to make more than X amount of dollars. It's like it's just impossible. If you live here, you can't make any more than that. And I'll look at them and then turn to my other friends from like New York or California. I'm like, are you sure? Like, are you sure, man? Say if I'm an engineer in India or Philippines or Taiwan or some other, or even like Ohio, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
where the salaries are different than like San Francisco kind of Bay Area salaries. What are some of the things I can do to kind of compete at the same level as like some of the talent in like San Francisco or California to reach like a similar kind of compensation
Yeah.
range?
Yeah, so that is such a good question. I'd be curious to know like what that X number is because I think that like that number that you target changes the strategy that you're going for.
Hmm. I agree. I agree.
Um, so for a company like mine, what I do for clients is I'm not hiring at San Francisco rates, which means
Yeah.
that I'm no longer hiring San Francisco engineers. And depending on where you live, like I may not be hiring anyone in, with your salary expectations either. It just might, be only countries where that is still like a fantastic standard of living because of exchange rates or
Mm-hmm.
anything else. Um, but what I can say is the best way to think about this is to put yourself in the shoes of that other company. Now, some other companies, when you start to think like them, you might realize that it's not a good fit. They're never going to hire
Mm-hmm.
you. They really want an American. Let's just pretend that it's an American company
Yeah.
let's just pretend it's a high paying American company. There are some companies that are just never going to hire you because you're not American. They're going to wind up having to pay premiums for Americans because of things coming close to like security clearances or other compliance issues or things like that. So I don't really have any advice if you have your sights set on a company that thinks that way, because I think that's just going to be a really hard hurdle to get over. The next hurdle that you're probably going to run into is kind of what I was getting at before, which is that if if a company like if a company has a target salary in mind and that's just like, okay, engineers cost this much, this is how much we're going to pay, you have to recognize that you might be bringing with you additional costs that, everything else being equal, so let's just throw out a nice even number. Like, let's just say they are paying engineers $100,000 and you're like, oh my God, $100,000 would be great. Like, hire me. Like, I can do React better than that American. Like, hire me. You have to realize that you are going to cost them more than the $100,000. They
Mm-hmm.
may not be used to hiring people in other countries. That might increase the amount of work and time that their accounting and HR departments have to deal with. It might cause some legal issues and headaches that they have to deal with. The time zone issue, they might worry that communication with you is going to be awkward either because of an accent, not understanding cultural references or other cultural issues. Um, not syncing up on holidays. Your writing might be slow. Like it's something that I see a lot on Slack is like you type a message to somebody and it takes like forever for them to write back a message. So there's issues like that. And so the thing that I would caution against is just if you expect to make, $100,000 because that's what they're paying Americans, you have to be very sure that the value that you are bringing overcomes additional costs that are either real or imagined. It doesn't even matter. But as long as
Mm-hmm.
they are thinking that there are additional costs with you, like you're not going to be able to come in at the same price. Um, so that being said, maybe they're paying $150,000 to Americans. You might now have the ability to say like, oh, 100,000 sounds pretty good. Uh, you can have me. I can do everything they can do and more, and you get to keep $50,000 to like spend on another engineer, and all you have to do is pay the low price of telling your accounting department to get their shit together and like tolerating a very mild accent, and you're getting a screaming deal and way more out of it. So I think the first step is really taking an honest sort of approach at understanding where the company is coming from. And if you do that, you'll find room for arbitrage and sort of determining where your value fits in. But there are other companies that are neither of what I mentioned, and they are literally just going to be going off of who is the best at solving a particular problem that they have, and everything else is going to be secondary. They are just
Mm-hmm.
going to say, we have $180,000 for a person who can do this the best. And if you can do that like narrow thing that they want solved better than anyone else, if you can get in front of them and they recognize that you can do it better than everyone else, they will not care where you are. They won't care about your accent. They won't care how much of a pain in the butt it is for HR. Like you're just going to get that job. And so I'm not sure I have particularly good advice on how to find those companies. My guess is that those companies may have very specialized languages, frameworks, particular technologies that might be new. I was going to use the word insular like communities, but they're going to have like a tight knit group of maintainers and authors and speakers and things like that know each other. And if you socially can get in good with that group, they might wind up at a pretty impressive company. And before anyone else knows, they say like, hey, we've got this position open. We know we want someone who's really good. And then because you are a known quantity and have positioned yourself as an expert, you might be able to just walk into one of those roles without any competition. They just might be thrilled to work with one of their friends, and the position is already earmarked at 180K. You are brought as the expert and like the best possible person that they can get at 180, and it's a done deal, and it doesn't matter where you are. So I would say those are the different situations, and your mileage may vary on how good you are at identifying those companies and getting in front of them.
Yeah, I'm 100% on the same page as you on all that. And one of the things to really highlight is like being good at React, being good at JavaScript, being good at C Sharp. That's not enough. So I think
Table stakes. Yeah.
yeah, those are table stakes.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, like so a lot of people they're like, oh, I'm gonna learn how to code, and then everyone says it's so hard to find engineers. I'll learn how to code, and bam, I'm one of those engineers that's so hard to find. So it's not actually hard to find engineers. Finding engineers is simple, easy. Actually, it's too easy. It's so easy that you have a filtering problem finding
Yeah.
quote unquote
Yeah.
engineers. It's finding competent engineers who like can work well with others and have like a
Mm-hmm.
proven track record of delivering. That's hard. That's
Yeah. I
hard.
would throw in communication. Like
Yeah.
communication is such a big thing. Yeah.
And trust. And that you already
Mm-hmm.
trust too.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the hard part. Like you can put up a job posting online and instantly get like hundreds of
Yeah,
applications.
that's true. Yeah.
As I've learned.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
then you
that's
like
very
filter
true.
by resumes that say React, and you're like, oh no, now I still have hundreds of applications.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I think a part of it is you really got to look at yourself and think like, am I like excellent? Like, am I like
Mm-hmm.
am I like really friggin' put in the work, and not only on the technical side, but have I put in the work to develop relationships with other people? Have I put in the work to like going back to the accounting thing? One common way around that is, have I put in the work to make my own LLC and figure out all the accounting on my end? And so when I talk to a new potential company, I can be like, oh, I already got all the invoices and everything all set up. Like, just forward me to your HR team. I got it all perfect, like clockwork. Removing all the barriers to make it as easy
Yeah.
as possible to hire you. Another kind of strategy I've looked into too is, if you compete as an employee, then you have to play by HR and employee rules. But when you start competing as a vendor or a service
Mm-hmm.
provider, that's where things get different, because now instead of talking to HR, you're talking to a different department. And instead of
Mm-hmm.
having to go through an interview process, you can present yourself as saying like, oh, like I solve this particular problem, or this company
Mm-hmm.
solves this problem, which I can
Yeah.
see you're starting to kind of do with some of the things you offer.
So yeah, so I do have a service where I help with recruiting at events, which comes from my JSLA experience. But yeah, I mean it's pretty outcome based. It's much less of like salary, hiring a body.
Hmm. So if you can position yourself as a person who solves a specific outcome, and that removes a ton of risk from the company. Because
Mm-hmm.
me as a manager, if it was in a perfect world, I wouldn't hire anybody. Like,
Yeah.
it's just like, if it's just like me and like the CEO and maybe like a designer buddy, and then just like a sliding scale that just you move up and down like AWS, and that's why AWS prints money. It's because you
Mm-hmm.
can just
Yeah.
move the thing left and right. Everyone has a good time. So
So,
if
sounds like you'd like Team Machine then.
a
My
team,
service for
yeah,
that.
exactly. That's the holy grail. So if you can position yourself as someone who provides a service, a great example is Leo. Shout out to Leo editing the podcast and his friends. Uh, I'm not paying him per hour. I'm paying for podcast
Mm-hmm.
edited. So
Right.
for me, I'm like, oh, this is the best deal in the world. And I know for
Yeah.
sure some days there's some technical issues in the podcast, so it's going to require more editing. And then some days I like look at the output for this. I'm like, this is pretty much 90% done. But I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't care.
Yeah.
So I know in return for taking on risk for like kind of variable time and income investment, like Leo gets to pocket the difference on the podcasts that are easier to edit. And
Mm-hmm.
like, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm still happy about that. So as an engineer, if you can think of ways to do that too, that's also a great option. But at the end of the day, if you want like like a Google like kind of job with a Google kind of team with a Google kind of salary, like you got to leave. Like you just you got to move. Like,
Yeah, I would
sorry.
say, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think some of those companies where they really have like their process is stronger than you. Like you can't out special. I mean, I guess you can at the super ultra top end, but for the like like what you were talking about for like this type of job, this type of team, like the bulk of their workforce, their engineers, like they have a very clear pipeline for that, and you have to fit into that. And depending on where you are, that just may not be available to you. Like you just might have to move to where that like the beginning of that pipeline is. Yeah,
Mhm.
that
I
conveyor
have a
belt.
great example with that. I won't say the company, but it was one of the bigger tech companies. One of the hiring managers for the ad tech team reached out to me on LinkedIn personally and like called me up and said, "Yo, we're hiring." And it was like one of the bigger companies. He's like, "Do you want to join the team?" I'm like, "Yeah." I'm like, heck yeah! I'm like, "Heck yeah, let's go." And then he's like, "Okay, I'll just connect you with a recruiter." And then I asked, "Oh, is this like, do I have to, just to clarify, is this like a lead code style interview kind of pipeline?" And recruiter's like, "Oh yeah, yeah, it's just similar to like the other companies." It's like, okay, cool. I need you to push this interview back 6 weeks because like I forget how to do all of this. Like
Yeah.
I'm like no ego whatsoever. I forget how to do all
Yeah.
this. And then so I sat down because it's like it's a cool team. The manager guy seemed cool. Sat down every night, did the leak code grind.
Wow, did the grind.
And I remember like doing the reverse linked list question and remembering to myself like I've taught myself how to do this 5 times in the last 10 years. So I went through that, showed up to the interview. Like it was like 5 interviews, like classic kind of like you've heard everywhere. And then at lunch I met the hiring manager and he said like, man, I'm really sorry. Oh no, like reverse the story. I did the phone screen. I like bombed the phone screen. Bombed the phone screen. Like complete. Like I got super nervous.
Because they were asking you technical questions, or
oh no, they asked like something to do with binary search, and like I was like coding it, and I was like I just screwed up a line and I got all flustered and I knew I was doing bad because they said don't worry, you're doing fine. And that caused me to worry more. So I did that. And then later that day, the hiring manager called me and he said, okay, so you failed the phone screen, but like, you're probably just like nervous, right? Like, yeah, honestly, I've never passed any of these phone screens. He's like, okay, we've never done this before, but I'm going to bring you on site anyway. And he's like, please just study harder. I was like, okay. And so I got on site anyway.
Okay. You did the grind.
I did that grind. There's like 4 or 5 interviews on site. Lunch interview was with him. And he said, man, I'm really sorry about the stupid interview process. Like, I just want to hire like 4 people, but like, this is just what we have to do here. I'm like, no problem, no problem. He's like, see, that's why I like you, James. You got a good attitude. You got a good attitude.
Nice.
But at the end of the day, I know I failed 1 out of the 5, maybe 2 out of the 5 interviews. I didn't get the job. And the moral of the story there is I had the hiring manager. He was like the VP, and he was trying to get me in. And
he was powerless.
The only way you can
the machine was too strong.
Yeah, the machine's too strong. The only way, I've heard stories of like people getting acquired by Google, Microsoft, Facebook, whatever, and then as an engineer on the team of the company that was acquired, not getting into Google because they didn't pass the lead code interview. So it's really, unless you're super top there, it's really hard to skip that machine. It's really hard to skip that process.
Yeah, the machine can also be really fickle too. Like, I have a lot of opinions about that. I think all the computer science riddles are really stupid, and it's a dumb way to hire.
The way I approach is more like, if you're playing Monopoly with your friends, you don't get mad that you're not allowed to, you're not playing chess. Like, if you show up to Monopoly game night and everyone knows you're all playing Monopoly and everyone like already prepared snacks, and you show up, you're like, oh, I hate Monopoly. This game sucks. Can we just play checkers?
Play chess.
Checkers is such a better chess is such a better game. Da da da. Everyone's like, yo, man, we already told you we're playing Monopoly. Like, can you please just play Monopoly? That's the way it's at. I've heard like friends at Google or in Facebook. One guy said he was interviewing someone. He was at Google and he was interviewing someone else, and he asked like, I don't know, like some binary tree question, and the guy refused to answer it, and he just said, dude, like what do you want me to do? Like, we're playing Monopoly.
You know where you are? Yeah.
Like, we told you. Like, we sent you this nice email. The recruiter, we already told you. Like, it's Monopoly night tonight. Like, it's chess night is across the street at the startup. Like,
right. Yeah.
So that's kind of the way I approach it. It's like, I don't get mad, and I don't get frustrated. But, you know, some people aren't that good at Monopoly, right? I'm actually, sidetrack, I'm excellent at Monopoly. I got really into it one summer, but that's a whole, I could do a whole podcast just talking about Monopoly strategies.
Next episode, I want to listen to that.
I think I think honestly might just get my buddy who's into board games and spend an hour talking about why Monopoly is not a good board game.
Oh yeah, I don't think anyone really thinks that Monopoly is a good board. Wasn't it? No. Well, yeah. Look, I think we're like super on tangent territory right now, but I think Monopoly was actually designed to like show people that like capitalism is horrible. That's why it's like not a fun game. I think that was the message.
Yeah, that was part
of the game. Yeah. Anyways.
That's so funny. Oh man, I love that. But yeah, going back on the on the hiring. Going back on the hiring side, so you mentioned one kind of thing, one problem you're able to solve on the time zone front is just by not having time zones in the first place. What are some other kind of problems you've bumped into trying to run remote teams that you wish somebody would have just told you, like, oh, just do this, it's a lot easier?
Um, I mean, I think it's kind of related to the time zone thing. Even getting rid of the time zones, which add, I think time zones add just like a ludicrous amount of latency. Latency is still a problem, and uh, I think embracing the characteristics of remote is important. And so what I mean by that is a lot of companies will sort of start doing remote, and they're going to be used to things that they have in a co-located office. So they're really going to expect like, okay, meeting time, everyone get on Zoom and then like approximate what they would do in person. And I think one of the strongest things that remote has going for it is asynchronous communication, and having it be written.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
there's going to be people who just think like, oh, there's no substitute for a live meeting, or like, okay, well, the closest thing we have to that is a video call, but like the idea of just having a voice call with someone, or like, oh, God forbid, just talking over Slack or text, like that just to them seems like such a loss and just so much worse. But the truth is, when you're talking with somebody, especially remote, like somebody like English may not be their first language or something like that. But even if it is, I mean, just think about politicians. It's so easy for someone not to answer your question. Like you can ask them like effectively a direct question, and they can say like, "Oh, that's a really good question. So okay, so this thing happened this morning," and they start telling you a story, and then already they've like completely derailed it, and you've forgotten your question. And you're like, "Okay, I think that kind of, all right. Well, I guess
Yeah.
moving on." And like it's so much easier to talk past each other, in a way that is way harder with writing. Like when you
Yeah.
are writing anything, like if anyone listening to this has experience writing a blog post, like you seeing your words, if you are getting your point across before you say it. The
Mm-hmm.
opposite happens when you're talking. Like right now, I don't actually know what I'm going to tell you before it comes out of my mouth, and only after is it out there I have to like, wait, did I say everything I meant to say? And then like I'll probably just let it go, and like I'll miss stuff. So writing has huge benefits to clear communication. It's before that message is sent, you can make sure, does it answer their question? Does it answer it well? You kind of alluded to this when you were like thinking about your engineer brain and making sure all the
Yeah.
contingencies were passed on to somebody. That's incredibly helpful in any system that has latency, because you're trying to minimize the number of round trips. Um, so that's one part of it. The second part of it is anything that is done in a video call is effectively useless from an institutional knowledge point of view.
Mm-hmm.
If you make the mistake of thinking that your team is the permanent organization that will survive the duration of your company, like you're delusional. Like new people are going to
Yes.
come on board, people are going to leave, and if you rely on verbal communication for everything, and you're not doing something crazy like recording everything and creating transcripts, like it's not searchable. Like if somebody comes in and tries to figure out why a decision was made, they can't just search, put a term into Slack and like search for the conversation and see like, oh, okay, I see that those were the points that they made up. It's very difficult for people to get up to speed. And that, like, even going beyond new hires, I mean, if somebody's just sick or out or on vacation or something like that, like if everything is written in text, they can get caught up much more quickly. So there's huge advantages to leaning on written communication. And I think a lot of companies that are not used to remote are going to default to things that
Yeah.
approximate co-located behavior, and it's going to hurt them.
Yeah. It's the nice thing. The thing I really like about remote is it forces you to be organized. And I'm a
Mm-hmm.
very organized person. Like I have everything on my calendar. Like I literally write lunch 12 to 1 in my calendar. I don't even have a real job right now. And I write lunch 12 to 1 because I'm like, oh, I gotta make sure I eat
Nice.
because otherwise, yeah,
Yeah.
I'm super organized person. So when I was like remote management side, I was like, oh, this is great. I'm like, this is like we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that, we're gonna like like I said, I'm a big fan of writing everything down
Mm-hmm.
ahead of time. I love using tickets. I love like having that all set up. I
Mm-hmm.
don't like the idea of like I've heard sometimes people describe themselves as, oh, we move fast here, and usually when they say that, it usually means they don't move that fast and they're just kind of stressed and disorganized.
We feel very harried here. Things are
Yeah,
very
it's like,
frantic.
yeah,
Yeah.
we're nimble. That was my favorite one.
Yeah.
We're nimble. I'm like,
Mm.
nimble. How come it takes 6 hours to deploy the website if you're nimble? Like, yeah, like things like
Yeah.
that. And part of that is my background doing like automation
Mm-hmm.
on deployments and CI/CD pipelines. And so when I started doing more management stuff, I'm like, oh, let's. I said right before this podcast, I mentioned that in the podcast form I made, uh, there's a place to paste your bio, and then
Right.
instantly I was like, oh, I should limit the character count so that way people can only paste smaller bios. Like that's just how my
Mm-hmm.
brain's always operating. So that's the
Totally.
nice side about remote. It kind of forces people to do that versus when you're co-located in the office. You can get away with a lot
Yeah.
co-located in the office.
Yeah.
You can just be a little bit chatty and not really produce and do things like not answer the question. Like,
Yeah.
oh, why didn't you finish this? Well, the other day, like my we just had a new baby, and oh, here's a picture, and like
Yeah. Now
instantly,
hold on, I got a
inst-
phone call. I gotta take this, but I'll be right back. Let's
I'll be right
yeah.
back. Yeah, and you can't. And the nice thing about remote, especially as an engineer, is you're really graded on what you produce. Period.
Mm-hmm.
So that's great if you produce stuff. But if you don't produce stuff, but you're like friendly in person, like you don't get any points for that remote.
Yeah.
Uh,
I wonder if that's true. I feel like actually one of the things that people miss in a remote environment, like, is that chatty, friendly culture. And I think if
yeah,
somebody was super active in Slack and like getting people into conversations and creating a pretty welcoming atmosphere, I think that would go a long way with me. I think they would have to produce
yeah,
less if they were
yeah.
doing that well.
Actually, honestly, if you're just here's the real secret. If you're just friendly, no, you can do whatever.
Yeah, yeah. But if you, you know, if you add energy to people and you increase morale, like people are going to keep you around.
Yeah, like I think the best example is I'm my keyboard player in my band back in LA. Now he's doing like he's running a website that's selling online courses, but he's not an engineer. He's more on the marketing side, and like me and him just like each other. And so when he calls me and says like, James, do you know anything about JavaScript? I'm like, yeah, and then we get in a call and the whole file's in PHP, and I say, "Wait, this is PHP," and he says, "Please, can you just help me? Like everything's just broken." Because we have that rapport and that
Yeah,
relationship, I'm just like, whatever.
yeah,
He's funny.
totally.
Whatever.
Yeah,
Let's go.
that
I
would
can
be
help
really
you out.
expensive for people who you don't like.
Oh yeah, yeah. if it was,
That would be way
if it
more
was like,
expensive. Yeah,
yeah, like if it's
yeah.
and that's what I like for my buddies. My rule of thumb is I never give a friend rate. I only have two
Hmm.
rates. I have full rate and free.
Yep.
So if you're my
Yep.
friend, I'll do stuff for free because then there's no expectations. Then it's like, oh,
Oh
this is
yeah.
just like a 1 hour phone call. And then
Yep.
if it
I
turns
think it's
into
good.
what, and then what happened with the keyboard player in this example is after an hour of going through and having conversations like, what do you mean you don't know where this code is? It turned into like, okay, I really want to help you, but you've seen this with me on this phone call. Like, you know, it's going to take at least 2 weeks
Yeah.
of stuff. And so like the only way I can give you that time is if like you pay the normal rate. And then luckily at this point he was like, dude, that's fine. We got an investor. Like just send the invoice. Like,
All right.
do
Cool.
you know how to send an
Great.
invoice? Like, yes. And so that
Great.
goes back to the beginning where
Everyone's
I
happy.
already
Yeah.
had the infrastructure set up where I had my little invoice templates and everything. So I was able to do that.
Made it easy. Nice.
And everyone's happy. Like, even though the code is like complete garbage and it's fine as the most unclear requirements because at first we thought it was going to be JavaScript and then he sends me a PHP file. It's
That's pretty
completely fine.
funny.
Everyone's happy.
But
Uh,
you know, kind of shows that even garbage code can make enough money that it becomes incredibly important to pay someone's high rate to have it fixed.
Oh, especially garbage code can make enough money. Like all my friends at Google, Facebook, like whenever I chat to my friend at Google, he says, "Like, oh, so how's Google going?" Because he works on search. He's like, it's all garbage and broken, but whatever.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, it checks out. Well, thanks so much for your time, David. I really appreciate it. Always like talking to you.
Yeah,
If people want
likewise.
to know more about you, what are some links? What are some things you want to plug?
Yeah, I mean, my company is Superstruct, so that's superstruct.tech. That's our website. You can probably find me on Twitter, David Guttman, just my full name, and I think those are the ones off the top of my head.
Okay, sounds great. Well, thanks again for tuning in for the James Hush Show. Hope you have a great rest of your week, and we will catch you next week.